Kia ora and welcome to The Detail. I'm Anna Fifield. This week, we're turning to the Pacific and looking at Australia's spectacular diplomatic blitz through the region over the past year, and in particular over the past few weeks.
We know that we're stronger when we stand together. These treaties represent one of the most significant endeavours Australia has ever undertaken in our history with any country.
That's Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in Fiji, where he and Foreign Minister Penny Wong signed two landmark treaties, including the Ocean of Peace Mutual Defence Pact, which commits both nations to defend each other in the event of an armed attack. New Zealand is now exploring joining it. Here's Prime Minister Christopher Luxon.
We want to engage with Australia and Fiji about our participation in joining the alliance. We think it's actually good for regional security across the Pacific.
To hear more about what Australia is doing in the region and why, I spoke to Stephen Jedgetts, Foreign Affairs correspondent for the ABC. He travelled across the Pacific with Albanese earlier this month. I asked him to tell me what Australia has been doing in terms of the diplomatic, security and other agreements they've been forging during their diplomatic tear.
Well, I mean, it depends whether you've got 2 hours or 2 minutes, Anna, because if I gave you a full list of everything, it would stretch on. But what we're basically seeing is Australia signing a raft of strategic agreements with large numbers of Pacific nations. I mean, if you look at everything that they've done, it's extraordinary, just the breadth of it. So originally this kicked off a few years ago when the government struck really groundbreaking agreements with both Tuvalu and then with Nauru, both small Pacific nations, which were basically strategic bargains, offering Tuvalu, for example, a new migration pathway to Australia, as well as plenty of budgetary support, offering extensive budgetary support to Nauru. In return, they got from both those countries basically a level of say over their security decisions, effectively a veto right over some of the decisions they'd make in the national security space. Since then, we've seen a landmark series of agreements with Fiji and Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea was the first agreement that was a full-blown treaty, which saw Papua New Guinea become Australia's third formal ally. And then more recently, we've seen yet another mad flurry of activity with the government signing the Nakamal Agreement with Vanuatu and the Ocean of Peace Alliance with Fiji, which, again, makes some pretty serious security provisions in terms of the commitments that Australia's making to Fiji. And that's before you go to the vast range of other things that Australia's been doing, including football diplomacy, sponsoring an NRL team, to the tune of $600 million inside PNG. The vast amount of aid that Australia has ploughed into the region. Things like the Pacific Policing Initiative, which is Australia basically building what some experts call a hub-and-spoke security model, but ploughing hundreds of millions of dollars into that as well. It has been a diplomatic full-court press of the highest order.
Yeah, you just mentioned the footy there. One thing I've been surprised about is the kind of creative diplomacy that Australia has been doing. This isn't just about security or security agreements and development and that kind of thing. But as you say, there's migration or climate change related policies for Tuvalu, Papua New Guinea being invited into the NRL. Is this kind of a different approach by Australia?
Yeah, I mean, the foreign minister talks about using the full toolkit at Australia's disposal, and they've left nothing in the shed, let's put it that way. Every possible way that Australia has been able to exploit its natural advantages, whether that's through NRL or through labour mobility or through migration pathways, they have moved to exploit it. So you see Australia doing things that, quite frankly, would have been completely inconceivable, a couple of years ago. If you'd told me, say, back in 2020, that Australia would sponsor an NRL team from PNG to the tune of $600 million in return for some secret security guarantees that are written into an addendum to that agreement in an attempt to stop China from getting a military presence in the country, I would have told you that you were hallucinating. And yet that's exactly what Australia has done. They've shown, a remarkable degree of ingenuity in some ways and a willingness to try things that in more benign strategic times they perhaps wouldn't have tried.
And I also noticed that Prime Minister Albanese, right after Fiji, went on to the Solomon Islands, where there's obviously been a change in leadership. And I think Australia is now working on another deal with the Solomons. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. There's also a bilateral treaty in the works with Solomon Islands. And on top of that, you've also got separate negotiations going on with Tonga as well for another broader agreement. Now, not all of these agreements are the same. In the case of, Tuvalu and Nauru, you've got Australia being given an explicit veto right, as I mentioned, over security decisions. In other agreements like the Nakamal agreement with Vanuatu, that's different again. Vanuatu guards its sovereignty very jealously. So Australia doesn't have a direct veto right, but it does have the right to effectively be consulted over some of the decisions that Vanuatu makes, including in the critical infrastructure space. Plus, Vanuatu's agreed to allow no militarisation of critical infrastructure. And then with the Fiji and PNG agreements, they're the sort of gold standard military alliances where you've actually got security guarantees being made. So not all of these agreements are identical, but if you go across the full waterfront, there is barely a Pacific nation left. That's, of course, if you exclude the compact states with the United States, the realm countries with close ties to New Zealand, and those countries that remain part of France. There is barely a Pacific nation left in the region where Australia hasn't tried to effectively transform its relationship in a profound way. So it really is a sea change.
Right. And this sea change come about because Australia one day woke up and thought, hey, I have to be a better big brother in the region. Or is this all about China?
Look, it's largely about China. And China's not the only thing here. Australia has other reasons to worry about the Pacific. The fact that the Pacific continues to lag by some metrics is going backwards when you look at some of those key measurements on things like child mortality, literacy, education, etc. It knows that climate change really does pose an existential threat to these countries. It's worried about the way the Pacific nations are increasingly disconnected from many of the networks, including commercial networks that allow modern economies to hum. So it's not all about China, but it's also true that there's no way Australia would have poured the amount of time, energy and money that it has into the Pacific were it not animated by a deep anxiety about China's presence in the region and the prospect of China getting a military foothold in the region. If you're asking why has this suddenly become perhaps Australia's most pressing foreign policy priority, the area where Australia is willing to pour the most money and effort in, the answer basically comes down to China and anxiety about what China could do in the region.
Right, and that anxiety seems quite well placed given the missile we've just had land in South Pacific waters and the naval task force from the PLA that went through the Tasman Sea last year. But what do you think Australia's specific concerns about China's goals and ambitions for the region are? Are they concerned about a Chinese militarisation of the South Pacific?
Yeah, I think the nightmare scenario for Australia is what is sometimes rather euphemistically called a Chinese military presence in the region. But basically what we're talking about is either a Chinese military base or a so-called dual-use facility, a notionally civilian piece of infrastructure that is effectively able to be switched on and turned into a military facility at the flick of a switch. That's the nightmare scenario for Australia. And Australia remains absolutely convinced, rightly or wrongly, that China has been sniffing around the Pacific looking for exactly such a facility. Now, the reason that this will cause Australia so much alarm is not because Australia imagines or Australian officials imagine that China would then use that military base to launch some sort of invasion of Australia. What they would hope to do, they believe, is that they would use that to shape the behaviour of Australia. So if China managed to get a military foothold in the region, that would constrain Australia's choices, particularly if there was some sort of military emergency in the region where Australia was contemplating joining, for example, a US response or a collective US and Japanese response to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. or in other circumstances. The basic assumption that Australian policymakers are making here is that if there is a Chinese military presence within easy striking distance of Australia that allows it to reach Australia more easily, more cheaply, without resorting to ICBMs, which are truly doomsday scenarios, or the task groups we've seen, which are expensive and time-consuming to send into the region, then it will be able to coerce and shape Australian behaviour much more effectively and easily. Not just Australia, also other countries, including New Zealand, as well as Pacific states as well. That's what Australia wants to prevent. It wants to try and maintain as much room for manoeuvre as possible in an increasingly uncertain and dangerous world. And that is why it's poured so much effort into the Pacific and into this game of strategic denial to ensure that China doesn't get that military foothold.
So while Australia has been on that diplomatic frenzy across the region, including that rugby league tie-up with Papua New Guinea and climate change visas for Tuvalu, what about us? What have we been doing? For some insight into our own Pacific reset and how that matches up, I talked to Anna Poles. She's an expert on geopolitical dynamics in the Pacific at Massey University. I started by asking her what New Zealand is doing in comparison and whether it's enough.
I think there's no doubt that perhaps New Zealand's approach is a little less spectacular than Australia's, certainly of late, given that, as you would have heard Stephen talk about, Australia has been engaging in building effectively this hub and spokes type system or sort of or architecture across the region and weaving in some as you say, fairly sort of creative and highly visible instruments from rugby league, as you say, to other forms of engagement, including this bevy of security agreements and treaties that we've seen recently. Obviously, New Zealand can't compete at that scale. Simply, Australia has greater financial weight, and because of that, is often more visible than New Zealand. But New Zealand also has a number of sort of comparative strengths as well. Access, particularly the relationship between New Zealand and Samoa, Tonga, Niue, Cook Islands, and Tokelau, of course, as well as the broader region too. So New Zealand's diplomacy in the region, I would say, though, there has been a significant increase in activity. New Zealand's Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, described the previous year as the most intensive year of Pacific diplomacy undertaken by a New Zealand political leader, arguably himself. Mm-hmm. And of course, New Zealand has, significant development cooperation programs in the Pacific. 69% of New Zealand's development spending is directed to the region. And this is not insignificant by any stretch. But what has been really interesting for those of us who spend time thinking about security issues in the Pacific is the way in which there's been this shift or sort of a distinct sharpening or hardening of New Zealand's approach in the region. And this is something that perhaps New Zealanders broadly might be less sort of comfortable. We're not really used to New Zealand playing hardball. And we saw this particularly in relation to Kiribati and the Cook Islands.
You cannot have both. You cannot say that we have this special relationship where consultation is required, not consult, and then say, well, that's no matter. In fact, what's wrong with that is that you're acting in a paternalistic and bossy way. We find that an affront.
And in both cases, we saw New Zealand signal this harder and more conditional approach to Pacific diplomacy. And this then led, as we saw in the case of New Zealand and the Cook Islands, a formal security agreement, which in some ways reflected elements of Australia's security agreements because it focused on what's called strategic denial, or seeking to keep other actors out of the region. So there has been this shift in the way that New Zealand has approached its Pacific diplomacy. And there's no doubt that New Zealand is seeking to position itself more strongly. New Zealand has offered to host and will be hosting the Pacific Islands Leaders Forum meeting summit in 2027. And so that'll be fairly significant. So there is certainly an uptick as I said, maybe less spectacular than Australia, but certainly it is there.
I asked Anna if New Zealand's motivations are similar to Australia's. Are we also worried about Chinese military expansion in the region?
There's no doubt that China is part of New Zealand's strategic calculation and has appeared in numerous official documents from around sort of 2018 onwards. There are strong concerns about Chinese involvement in policing, critical infrastructure, security agreements such as that between Solomon Islands and China, and consecutive New Zealand foreign ministers, including current Foreign Minister Winston Peters, have all said explicitly that New Zealand is seriously concerned about China's engagement in the Pacific, that it sees China as potentially as destabilizing, and certainly the recent testing of the submarine-launched ballistic missile is an example of that, as was the September 2024 ICBM as well. So New Zealand does share these concerns and has done so for a number of years. And this is where we see considerable alignment between Canberra and Wellington, particularly.
Why is China so interested in the Pacific? What does it want in this part of the world?
Well, it's a question that has been sort of debated for a number of decades, actually. And China has a number of overlapping interests. Votes at the UN, for example, resources, access to fisheries, access to logging, deep sea minerals, for instance, which is a critical interest, as well as influence and the dismantling of Taiwan's remaining allies. And in the Pacific has long been this bolt hole for Taiwanese allies, but China has systematically whittled them down to 3 remaining countries in the region. That's Palau, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands. And so that has been a critical element of it, the expanding of China's diplomatic influence, seeking support from Pacific countries for its core interests at the UN and in other bodies as well. Then, of course, as I mentioned, the commercial opportunities, particularly fisheries, logging, increasingly, though, critical infrastructure, telecommunications markets as well. And we see, and this is another area that is of concern to many, is Chinese advancement in the areas of critical infrastructure across the region, as well as digital infrastructure too. Then, of course, there's that broader strategic competition that's taking place. And in the Pacific, we largely see that between China and Australia and New Zealand. But of course, the China-United States tensions are there as well.
You're very well connected across the Pacific. What do the people there tell you about how they view this? Are they welcoming renewed Australian and New Zealand interest in their region, or do they feel like they're just pawns in this great power rivalry that's playing out now?
Well, it's important to first acknowledge that there's no single Pacific view. And obviously, across the region, there is a diversity of perspectives on the way in which Australia, New Zealand, and others, China, United States, and so on, are engaging in the region. Obviously, there are close historical ties between New Zealand and parts of the Pacific, and between Australia and parts of the Pacific as well, and those relationships are valued, but there are still concerns, and there are frustrations that Pacific priorities, as laid out, for instance, in the 2018 Boy Declaration on Regional Security, which lists climate change as the existential threat, followed by a number of other key issues such as transnational organized crime, cybersecurity, environmental security, for example. There are concerns that the geopolitical tensions and contestation in the region, and how crowded the region has become as a consequence of so many different countries and actors seeking to engage with Pacific countries, as part of this geopolitical contestation. There are concerns that that is undermining Pacific priorities, it's crowding out Pacific priorities. And there is some understandable suspicion about the sudden urgency of the level of engagement that we're seeing in the region. So Pacific leaders they see that these announcements and visits and security initiatives have accelerated at the time in which there is heightened concern about Chinese influence. And this leads to this fundamental disconnect over the perceived security threat in the region and the definition of security itself. But I think it's also really important to distinguish between the way in which the Australia and New Zealand are perceived as members of the Pacific Islands Forum. So there's greater expectations of Australia and New Zealand because the two countries, they're founding members of the Pacific Islands Forum, and they are signatories to the various different declarations and agreements on the issues like climate change, like Ocean of Peace, for example. And there's a sense that Australia and New Zealand really do need to step up and meet those commitments, in addition to the recognition that Australia and New Zealand also have their own national security considerations as well. There's a real tension in the region around these issues. Pacific states, they're not passive actors in this. They're using this competition to diversify their partnerships, to negotiate better agreements and increase their diplomatic leverage as well. But that's not a win-win situation by any stretch of the imagination, because there are growing concerns about the implications for Pacific countries to be able to continue to balance China and the West effectively.
That's it for this week. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This Saturday episode is made with funding from the Peter M. Ackland Foundation. Thank you to Stephen Jedgetts and Anna Poles. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by William Saunders. I'm Anna Fifield, and I'll be back next Saturday. Mā te wā.